You went to Columbia Business School, and I assume you did pretty well there because you went to Goldman Sachs afterwards.
Right.
But what year did you join Goldman?
In 1994.
So you worked there for a while, and then how did you decide you wanted to go into technology banking?
Right. So like all things, land of the blind, one-eyed man is king. And at the time, technology for us was defense contractors. We had another company we took public, one called Microsoft. We had this other company we called IBM. And that was the world of technology as far as Goldman was concerned.
Were there a lot of African Americans in the technology area at that time?
Very few, very few. I was our first M&A banker on the ground in San Francisco focused on tech. And then we decided to form a tech group. And so that created another nexus and dynamic of opportunity.
Your job is to convince clients to hire Goldman.
You got it.
And to give them good advice.
Right.
Did you meet Steve Jobs?
I didn't meet Steve Jobs personally, but I was on the team that we actually got engaged. We had to, at the time, you may not remember this, Apple was under assault. Steve said, I'm not coming back unless there's a different board. So we fired the board, got rid of the CEO, and invited Steve to come back.
All right, so you're doing very well out there. You're now living in San Francisco area. You're making a big success. You're by investment banking standards. I presume you're highly compensated, so forth. What propelled you to say, I'm going to give all this up and go start my own company?
Right. So the interesting thing that occurred, again, as an engineer, I realized way back in my Goodyear and Tire and Rubber days, the impact that software really had on businesses. The thing that I noticed that there's very few software companies were actually efficiently run. Well, why? The big part was most executives who started software companies, well, they wrote code, or they knew a market opportunity and they sold the code. There was never anyone who taught them how to run software companies. So I then run into this small company, I'll say small, in Houston, Texas, that is the most efficient software company I've ever seen. They had some very basic things that they just did extremely well. And I said, wow, if you took those basic things and actually applied them ultimately to other enterprise software companies, you could run those businesses very similar to the way they ran theirs and would create tremendous value in those companies. That was the idea, that was the conceit.
And they said, that's a good idea, why don't you do it?
Well, yeah, in essence. I said, well, if you actually thought about taking some of these best practices and putting them in buying enterprise software companies and driving them forward, you could actually do pretty well. And I said, that's a great idea, would you do that? And I said, well, and they gave me one of those offers that looked quite interesting. And I remember my lawyer said, this is a bad deal, Robert, but you should take it.
Right. So you went to Goldman and said, I'm leaving.
Right.
Did they try to talk you out of it? I presume they did.
Of course. They made the pitch against it. But, like all things, David, at some point in time in your life, you got to look yourself in the mirror and say, you have to take a little risk and go see if this is something that's going to work.
How old were you when you took this?
I was 39 years old. Okay. And it's so interesting. So, of course, I started doing research. It was the same age that others left what they were doing to go start their businesses. So I said, well, let's go give it a run.